Citizenship on the Go. Lesson 8. American Government. The Executive Branch. Part 1. The President. This lesson explains the structure and the function of the executive branch of U.S. government. In the United States, there is one legal document that is above all others. This document is the supreme law of the land. The supreme law of the land is the Constitution. As the supreme law of the land, the Constitution protects basic rights of Americans, even from lawmakers and other people in government. The Constitution also defines the government, explaining what the different parts of government are. How the parts of government work, what their responsibilities are, and what they can and cannot do are also outlined in the Constitution. In other words, the Constitution sets up the government. The Constitution sets up the legislative branch, or Congress. It sets up the judicial branch, or the court system. The Constitution also sets up the executive branch of government. This is the branch of government that includes the president, the vice president, and the presidential cabinet. The Constitution defines the executive branch as a separate part of government from the legislative and judicial branches. It establishes that the president and certain other government officials are members of the executive branch, and it sets up their specific powers and responsibilities. Civics test question. What is the supreme law of the land? What is the supreme law of the land? The Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Civics test question. What does the Constitution do? What does the Constitution do? Sets up the government. The Constitution of the United States sets up the government, defines the government, and protects the basic rights of Americans. The Constitution defines the U.S. government as a three-branch system. The three branches of government set up by the Constitution are the legislative branch, which makes new laws, the executive branch, which enforces the law, and the judicial branch, which reviews and explains the law. All three branches of government have their headquarters in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. The country's 100 senators, 435 voting members of the House of Representatives, and the other members of Congress meet in Washington, D.C.'s Capitol building to do the work of the legislative branch. The 9 Supreme Court justices and other people who work for the federal court system meet in the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. to do the work of the judicial branch. The president and other members of the executive branch meet to carry out their constitutional duties in the White House. The president is in charge of the executive branch, but he's not the only member of the branch. Within the executive branch, the Constitution also defines the roles of the vice president and of other cabinet members. The vice president and the rest of the presidential cabinet work alongside the president to enforce the law, or make sure the law is followed. Civics test question. Name one branch or part of the government. Name one branch or part of the government. President. One part of the government is the office of the president. The president is in charge of the executive branch. Other parts of government include the courts, which make up the judicial branch, and Congress, which is in the legislative branch. An important principle of the government defined and set up by the Constitution is separation of powers. The Constitution gives different parts of government different powers, putting legal limits on what each part of government is allowed to do. The courts have powers that are different from the powers of Congress. Congress has powers that are different from the powers of the president. Each branch has powers that are kept separate from the powers of the other two branches in order to prevent any one part of government from becoming too powerful and running the country on its own. For example, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI, has the job of investigating possible threats to the people of the United States in order to help law enforcement throughout the country stop illegal activities. The FBI is a part of the Department of Justice, which is in the executive branch of government. The director of the FBI reports to the Attorney General, who is a member of the President's cabinet. As head of the executive branch, though, the President steps in if needed to give orders to the FBI. The legislative and judicial branches often review reports on FBI activities to check that the people who work for the Bureau are following the rules, and to check that the director of the FBI, the Attorney General, and even the President of the United States have not been breaking the law by ordering the FBI to do something unconstitutional. Although court justices and congresspeople review FBI activities, however, they do not have the power of telling the FBI what to investigate. Justices, senators, and House representatives are not allowed to assign cases to the FBI, and they don't have the power to tell FBI agents to not investigate something either. Those powers belong to the executive branch and are kept separate from the powers of the legislative branch and the judicial branch to prevent Congress or the Supreme Court from getting too powerful, partly by making it illegal for corrupt justices or corrupt congresspeople to block investigations into their own activities. There are many other ways that separation of powers limits what each branch of government can do. The system of separation of powers is closely related to the system of checks and balances. The Constitution not only gives each part of government separate powers, but it also gives each branch of government ways to check the other two, ideally balancing things out so that no one branch gets so powerful that it takes over the entire government. In addition to overseeing the FBI, for example, the executive branch has the power of appointing certain members of government, such as federal judges. For a federal judge appointed by the president to formally take office, however, Congress must approve the appointment. This means that the executive branch and the legislative branch both have some say in who joins the Supreme Court. Supreme Court justices, in turn, have the power to declare bills made by Congress unconstitutional. Even if the president signs a bill into law, if that law is ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, it's thrown out. The Supreme Court can also strike down executive actions if the justices determine that the action goes against the Constitution. Since the separate powers of each branch are balanced against the powers of the others, and each branch has ways of checking the other two, no one branch has all the power. Civics test question. What stops one branch of government from becoming too powerful? What stops one branch of government from becoming too powerful? Checks and balances. The system of checks and balances and the principle of separation of powers are set up in the Constitution to stop one branch of government from becoming too powerful. The executive branch of U.S. government has several parts. At the top, in charge of the whole branch, is the president. The vice president and other members of the president's cabinet are also in the executive branch. Together, they work to carry out the duties of the branch. The Constitution says that the job of the president and of other people in the executive branch is to carry out and enforce the nation's laws, especially the supreme law of the land. This means that the executive branch has a responsibility to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. Most people serving in cabinet level positions are in charge of federal departments or agencies, such as the FBI. Those departments and agencies, which have millions of people working in them, are also part of the executive branch. As Chief Executive Officer of the United States, the President has many special powers and responsibilities. Since the President is in charge of the executive branch, whoever is President is at the top of the command chain for the millions of people who work for federal agencies or departments like the Census Bureau, which has the job of gathering up-to-date information on the population of U.S. states and territories, or the Department of Defense, which has the job of working to prevent war and ensuring the U.S. military is able to protect the country from foreign threats. As head of state, the president enforces the nation's laws. If needed, the president can command federal law enforcement to take specific action to counter illegal activities. The president also signs bills into law or vetoes bills passed by Congress. Vetoing bills is a key way the executive branch can check the legislative branch. The president appoints federal judges, too, and is commander-in-chief of the military. This means the president makes many important decisions about the U.S. Army, Navy, Air Force, and other branches of the nation's armed forces. The president lives in the White House in Washington, D.C., and carries out many of the duties of the executive branch there in a room called the Oval Office. The first president of the United States, George Washington, did not live and work in the White House. For the first year of his presidency, Washington actually lived in New York City, because New York City was the first capital of the United States. After Washington retired from public office, however, all three branches of federal government moved to new headquarters in the District of Columbia, or D.C., and the new capital city was given the name Washington, in addition to D.C., in honor of the first president of the United States. In Washington, D.C. today, there are many reminders of the first president of the United States, including paintings and statues of George Washington found in many rooms of the White House, where the current president lives and works. Civics test question. Who is in charge of the executive branch? Who is in charge of the executive branch? The president. The president is in charge of the executive branch. Civics test question. Who is the commander-in-chief of the military? Who is the commander-in-chief of the military? The president. The president is the commander-in-chief of the military. Civics test question. Who was the first president? Who was the first president? Washington. The first president of the United States was George Washington. Washington served 2 terms as president before deciding to retire. The capital of the United States, Washington, D.C., is named after him. The president does not make federal laws. Only Congress makes federal laws, and Congress is in the legislative branch, while the president is in the executive branch. However, the president is involved in federal lawmaking at one key step of the process. For a law to be made, an idea for the law, called a bill, must be introduced in Congress by a senator or a representative in the House. Often, senators or representatives will get the idea for a new law from people outside of Congress, because the First Amendment to the Constitution gives all Americans the right to petition the government in various ways, including by directly contacting Congresspeople to give them their opinion on an issue. Once someone in Congress has introduced a bill, the bill is debated in the House or in the Senate and goes through changes before House representatives or senators vote on an updated version. If that version gets enough supporting votes, it is discussed further by members of both parts of Congress and voted on again by both the House and the Senate. If the bill passes in Congress, that's when the president gets involved. A bill that has passed in Congress goes to the president to either be signed into law or vetoed. A presidential veto is a rejection, and vetoed bills go back to Congress to be changed, discarded, or pushed through by a majority vote. The Constitution gives the president up to 10 workdays after delivery of a bill to the White House to decide whether to sign the bill into law or veto the bill. If a bill that has passed in Congress is sent to the executive branch and 10 days go by without the president taking action one way or the other, the bill is either automatically passed or automatically vetoed, depending on whether Congress is in session when the deadline is reached. The president's ability to sign or veto a bill is a major power the executive branch has to hold the legislative branch in check. Civics test question. Who makes federal laws? Who makes federal laws? Congress. Federal laws are made by the Senate and the House of Representatives, which together form the national legislature, or Congress. Civics test question. Who signs bills to become laws? Who signs bills to become laws? The President. When the President signs a bill passed by Congress, it becomes law. Civics test question. Who vetoes bills? Who vetoes bills? The President. If against a bill becoming law, the President has the option to reject the bill by vetoing it.